Hello again, everybody. We are now going to have, I can tell you already, a fascinating session um, with Rebecca Robbins, who is the author of Five Generations at Work, How We Win Together for Good, um, which is not just any old business book. I mean, there are lots of them, but there's not just any old business book, but I think gets us onto um, territory of the future. My impression or my experience with most business books is that they exist to tell you how great their authors are. Rebecca's book, I think, is much more. I mean, it does that, but it also, and more importantly, tells us something about the choices that we have ahead of us and how we might approach them. So, first of all, welcome to you, Rebecca. And shall we pile straight into it?
Fantastic. Well, first of all, again, thank you to Raj and to you, Sir Trevor, for such an energizing opening and a gambit, and also thank you to everyone who has taken the time to join today. And I think I might just pick up on something that you mentioned. I think you used the word hope two or three times, Trevor, and I think deeply relevant, deeply resonant for so many of the things that you've already touched on, and I think we'll come on to talk about in the course of the next 2 days. And you just reminded me, again, you'll probably pick that up, but for those of you who've read the book, I do love a poignant quote, but you reminded me of John Berger, who in his iconic ways of seeing talked about poetry and more hopeful narratives and the ability to defy the space which separates. So to defy the space which separates. So I think it's really powerful that you mentioned hope. So, but I'd like to very much begin with all of you, all of us on the call on the session today, because of course we have such a melting pot and diversity of roles and responsibilities represented here. And as you touched on earlier on, one thing unites us all. This is about human talent, the potential and possibility of human talent. And I think context, and much of that context you articulated so powerfully. We're living through these firsts in history. We're living through and working through times of profound change. And I think, again, we all sense, I'm sure a lot of people who have joined this call, one of the reasons is we share in that hope, we share in that ambition in terms of how we will be part of that solution, how we will be productive and contribute to looking at how we can be part of that sense of change in a much more constructive way. So I think that context of our times has to be deeply operative to this conversation, as you and as you said, Sir Trevor. And one of the reasons I wrote, in writing that book, was about, well, how will I have been part of the solution? So I've realized with my third book, I write books when I have a problem to solve, and I think that's really important. So this really is thinking about, through this greater complexity, the intensity and the urgency of force factors, we know that problems are more interconnected, and we know that a lot of our work as people leaders and in the roles represented on the call today, they're intrinsically more at the intersection of things. And so thinking about how we mitigate risk while we maximize opportunity and planning for the future potential of our business, which is why leadership mindset on the potential of how we see five generations at work is so mission critical to all of this. And I'll just touch on a few points here that, we are living through that first in history. And I think we are the first movers in that moment. Through any first in history, this is the first time we are experiencing this level of demographic diversity. It's not going to come again in that sense of, those first few years, because it's going to go into that same trajectory of travel. And as we know, population data evidences this. As I'm sure everyone on this call would agree, it's not a project, it is not an initiative, it's not a trend. This is a fundamental demographic fact. And you spoke to some of those facts earlier on, so Trevor, around populations of the world. They are aging and they are shape-shifting. And of course, with that, we have profound implications on so many levels, not least that many of us shall want and need to work for longer. The context, therefore, that we are all working in and living through is the most demographic is the most demographically diverse in history. And of course, that's a transformational shift. And I think that transformational shift is really important when it comes to thinking about our responsibility, our agency, and the opportunity for our talent. But not just the opportunity for our talent, because again, this is not in a vacuum, because in the same way that we have five generations in our workplaces, broadly the same applies to our customers, our consumers, our clients, our partners, and our stakeholders. So I guess, as we sort of round out the sort of first opening gambit really is that, this is about shifting from a multi-generational status quo, if you will, to the intergenerational business opportunity. Because if we think about multi-generational, it simply describes and sets the context for the construct, the composition. But the intergenerational is hardwired to our business. This is where the real work gets done. This is how we think about setting the conditions for our collective capability. How do we maximize the shared mindset, the skill set, the toolkit in our people? Where does individual difference that you spoke to earlier meet collective potential? How do we harness that? How do we empower that? How do we sustain that relevance over time through conditions that are ever more volatile, uncertain, fragmented, and fractured? So again, that sense of agency, individual and collective agency, I think it's ever more vital through this confluence of force factors that are absolutely impacting us all in business and in society, which again, you touched on to points such as social mobility, for such a profound point. Inflection points in AI, automation, climate, geopolitics, and so much more. So I think that, the round out here is with this complexity and intensity of the wicked problems that whether we're solving for directly, we're being impacted by them. And so, our world of work is fundamentally changed. The whole notion and trajectory of a career, of pathways, the skills that you touched on. So that punchline really is that in our expanded demographic, this is mission critical because we have, as never before, a melting pot and a crucible of expertise and perspectives and knowledge and skill sets. And I think, again, to your point about the leadership responsibilities, Sir Trevor, that's where this represents a first mover moment in history.
Well, that's a good opening shot. And by the way, at Green Park, we try not to use titles. I mean, I only use my title when I have the horse with me. So Trevor is fine.
I like that.
Um, I think what you open up there is fascinating. What do you think? Well, let me start with this. We're going to take some questions.
Yeah.
I think we'll take them off the chat a little later. But let me abuse my position as chair to ask my questions to begin with. Um, what objectively do you think has got us to this point? And I noticed interesting you say you don't think it'll occur again. What's the demographic picture?
So to your point about it occurring again, what's exciting about these years is that we're in the first time this is happening. And I think that's why I reinforce the fact that whether, you're a people leader in the business of people, whatever your role is, again, as the hundreds of people we have joining today, we're in a moment in time where how we choose to act will have defined what will have changed. And I think that's particularly exciting. I suppose the analogy is any inaugural point in time is particularly exciting. So that's why I think, we are in a peak moment here. So it's not to say, obviously, that those times won't continue, but these years now, who would have acted now will have set, I think, leadership, pioneering examples of what will have changed and some of the things that you talked about. The objective reality is, I think, is a really important one to pick up on. And I love that you brought that up early because, we are here in 2025 talking about all the things that you just laid out in your opening gambit. What are we really grappling with in the world? What are we solving for? What are more hopeful futures? And you painted a picture, I think, that's very important, Trevor, in terms of, this is decades of time. But that shouldn't feel other. It shouldn't feel abstract. It should feel something that we all have agency over. So going back to that point about objectivity, we are here in 2025 and we should be beyond now this divisive discourse, because one of the problems I was looking to solve in the whole sort of, vision behind the book was this incessant rise and proliferation of just too much divisive discourse really around generations. And we know where some of that comes from, because with the rise of media and marketing and the need for brands to stay relevant, of course, every single organization in many respects is, of course, chasing and looking to stay relevant to the next consumer. However, going back to that point, in let's hopefully more enlightened times, we are here in 2025. We should be far beyond this. This should not be now about solving for conflict and for friction. We should be beyond the labels and thinking more through the lens of lenses and thinking more through the whole notion of lenses and much more constructive conversation. So again, this is spiraled really into and you touched on this, and I think you mentioned around, what has been hyped and stereotyped to the extent where almost you see, generations being pitted against each other in surveys and marketing and media. And what was fascinating about the research in the book, and by the way, that research was across businesses, it's a huge swathes of business, but not just business, to your point. And thank you for mentioning that, because it was across education, it was across government and social enterprise. And the hypothesis was, going into those years of research, and it reached across 4 continents, was the fact that surely there is more evidence, because I was certainly seeing that, my co-author Patrick was as well, around evidence of our generational diversity as a strength. And that certainly shone through in the research. And these leaders who were leading this work, they were not in conflict resolution. They were not solving for gaps and problems. Not needless to say, it doesn't mean to say they weren't working through challenges along the way. But really, this was a maximizing mindset that was looking ahead, whether it's 3, 5, 10 years time. Here's where we are going with our organization. So again, this was examples include everything from better unlocking cross functionality across the verticals in the organization. They're investing in more horizontals across their organization. So I think this raises maybe some questions, as we could again. I will come on to questions later, but I think if we may, I'd like to float a couple out now. So how are we looking at the most diverse demographic in our organizations? How well do we understand that demographic? How well do our people understand each other? And to your point, how well do we value each other? One of the principles that came through loud and clear, and looking at family businesses, because of course, family businesses are generational in construct. So that had to be, it constitutes a large chapter in the book. But of course, that's a great source of territory and a source of information and data and insights. What are the leading family businesses doing? What can they tell us about how they're looking at knowledge transfer, succession, next generation development, planning, etc.? And again, the principle of respect and mutuality came up time and time again in terms of their cultural values. So the shift really, again, is how we are wiring for more effective intergenerational, again, go back to that word, intergenerational dynamics, how we collaborate, how we innovate, how we look at opportunity. And, let's also think about how we learn from and with each other. Are our performance and learning systems and organizational structures wired for this kind of discussion that we're having, and the things that you touched on as the world of work has changed? That's not easy for people leaders. It's difficult with so much uncertainty. In some industries, it's getting really challenging. But again, I think that's what's exciting in terms of bringing together and convening such a collective of minds today. How can we as a collective problem solve more effectively? How can we share knowledge, and break down, again, I think some of the silos that have existed, across our own organizations, with the dose of healthy competition. I was just with a group of foresight leaders yesterday who've brought together a collective of foresight thinking across different organizations, taking some of those competitive barriers down in the name of the greater good of, what can we learn from each other? So again, I'll just float those questions out, because I think it'd be really interesting to hear, how is that manifesting in what people are doing on the talent conference who are with us today.
People tend to do things either because some measurement tells them, the whole McKinsey thing tells them to do it. But in my experience, generally because they're on a burning platform, there's crisis. They can see up ahead that there's a catastrophe, and they want to get in ahead of them. Let me ask about a couple things that I think might drive interest and active action on the agenda that you're laying out. One is that this is just a very practical thing. Most in most organizations historically, I think that there's some alignment between longevity and hierarchy. Longer you've been there, the higher up the tree you're going to be, or the higher up the tree you're going to be, it tends to correspond to how long you've been there. And roles carry some kind of respect with them. In your 5 generational landscape, I suspect that hierarchy isn't quite what it used to be, if I can put it that way. How much of a challenge do you think that is? And did you get some sense that there are organizations who are recognizing this?
Yes, that's a great point. And I think, those organizational structures are fascinating around, how are we already leaning into this? And the examples in the book, the book just came out just last year. So that work is still very fresh, but already that is evidencing, with a number of, the case studies in the book represent just a small example of that body of evidence. But of course, Trevor, they were investing in that work anywhere between 3, 4, 5, 6, or indeed more years ago. So that's why I go back to that point around, this window of time that we're living through and working through is a really, I think, a first mover advantage for those of us who choose to be at the higher end of that spectrum, if you will, not in a hierarchy sense, but a sense of taking agency and constructive action. So the big answer is yes. And it's interesting. There's a case study that it's a beautiful segue, actually, I think, to one of the case studies that might give a little bit of articulation around this. And I want to come back as well to your point around motivation, because what's interesting is that there were consistent motivations around sort of what triggered a lot of the examples that we celebrate as, leading cases and examples in the book. And one of those is LVMH, the LVMH group. And it's a fascinating example for many reasons. But I wonder if we can, I don't know how much audience participation we can wire. I'm not suggesting we do a poll, but we can maybe get a little bit of a pulse if that's okay. Because I'd be
Sure.
interested in organizational values, Trevor, around if we were to ask the question and do a quick, maybe we do some answers in the chat, but if we think about organizational values worldwide, we might think about our own, others. If we had only one value to choose that we said, okay, this organizational value shows up in the top 3 consistently in organizations across the world, which value would we take a big bet on selecting? So which value consistently shows up in the top 3 of organizations across the world would we venture?
We're asking people, and you can respond in the chat here to say not which values they would want to see, but what values would they anticipate uh, the frequency
Yes,
being.
exactly. Frequency is
Okay.
perfect, exactly. And they're coming in thick and fast. So this is fantastic. Courage, respect, integrity, and innovation. Respect is coming up very loud and clear, isn't it? As is collaboration, honesty, more integrity, bold and courage. I love this. Agility, empathy. Oh, we've got what a fantastic collective of minds we have on this call. This is wonderful. Oh, this is fantastic. Oh, care, Penny. We'll come back to care. That's
Mhm.
really prescient in other contexts. Ethics. Oh, we've gone from hope to love, Trevor, and now humanity. This is wonderful. I think, we'll have to feed this into your asymmetric sensitivity report somehow. This is brilliant. Well, we've got a good sample with, I think, a couple of hundred people on with us already.
A
Oh,
lot of collaboration. I'm rather struck that greed hasn't shown up yet, but anyway.
very glad it hasn't. I love Buddy has come in with a nice triptych there, which is brilliant. So thank you. Oh, Chris, you're our new best friend, long-term thinking. Absolutely. The final chapter of the book is about future generations. So thank you so much for that. We'll continue to let that roll, but thank you. Well, the answer according to Oxford Said, whom I do a lot of work with, and they have conducted studies over the best part of the last decade, and this is national, it's regional, it's across different industries. So that segmentation is cut and diced in a number of ways. Consistently, the organizational value that showed up in the top 3, so broadly number 1, but at the very least number 3 was collaboration. So a lot of people, whether it's collaboration, teamwork, or synonyms thereof, clearly we're on the money with our talent conference, because that has come up. So thank you for that. And there's a reason that I flagged that up, because of course collaboration is at the beating heart of our ability to do the things that you talked about, Trevor, around our ability to be productive, to contribute. Because if we don't have the conditions for effective collaboration in this more expansive demographic of our workplaces, not least with our clients and customers and stakeholders, we are not going to get to those next stages of growth, how we sustain relevance, how we're more inclusive, how we think about being part of the solution in social mobility, and so on and so on. So this is why this matters, and it's such a big picture agenda. This is not a project, as I said, or a trend. This is intergenerational in the business. So, food for thought as we go into the LVMH case study around what does collaboration look and feel like in our organization? What do we say about it? So is it one of our values? And what do we do about it? How are we actively investing in it? I talk a lot about how we build and exercise muscle in collaboration. And so the work of LVMH was fascinating, not least because, as we know, so LVMH, as I'm sure all of us
Can
know,
you walk us through that, Rebecca?
yeah, happy to do so. And so LVMH, as we know, is one of the most influential luxury groups in the world. They own brands such as Dior, Louis Vuitton, Sephora, and many others. So they own over 75 brands. And that 75 brands is deeply operative. I'm just going to go through a couple of important stats because it reflects your point, Trevor, that you opened up with about asking me about org structures and hierarchy. So this is a group that is structured 75 brands, highly articulated verticals where the flow of knowledge within each one of those verticals is absolutely high performing, top of its game. Those 75 brands sit in then another 6 verticals, which are 6 different categories, from fashion, leather goods to jewelry, watches, etc., etc. 200,000 employees. So that's the broad organizational picture. Highly articulated, high performing individual brands and a portfolio of very strong verticals. What was interesting as we go back 6, 7, 8 years ago, and again, as I say, LVMH does not often go on the record around talking about what they're doing on the inside of their business. So highly privileged for this to be such an open case study. And they shared not only what they did, but how they did it and why they did it. What was less prevalent at the time was this horizontal muscle in the organization. And the reason I love sharing this study is that this case study it was inspired by one individual, because we could argue that Rebecca, of course, well, LVMH, it's a luxury business, it has the resources to do this. It was inspired by one individual, and she was working within one of the brands. She hit sort of 4 or 5 years in, and she thought, well, I need to move on to, so it's a great story in pathways, mobility, the things that you were just touching on. And she said, well, I'd quite like to stay at LVMH, but I realize I don't know as much as I should about those 74 other verticals, if you will. And so hence this vision was born. And it's a great example of, individual agency instead of solving. Exactly. I love that. Sorry, I've got to say, Smita's just, it made my day, because exactly, it goes back to that very principle. And instead of solving the problem for herself, she thought, I'm going to solve this for everyone else potentially, or for everyone else who might be going through this in these 200,000 people. And what she set up, Trevor, was a platform called DARE. And that DARE is an acronym. It stands for Disrupt, Act, and Risk to be an Entrepreneur. And it's an open platform that she established with the support, by the way. And this is where I think people leaders now, everyone here, the head of people and the head of learning at the time both supported her in creating the business case. And that, again, a critical ingredient as to why this became a reality. They said, write the business case. It was a very lean team that got it going. And it was formed as an entrepreneurial platform. So this is not innovation in a silo in a lab. This was, we are a highly creative industry as LVMH. We work in the business of creativity, and we need to invest better in how we understand each other, how we work with each other, how we collaborate, ideate, innovate, and crucially, how we exercise that muscle of collaboration. Because what this platform does is, so Arnaud, he said, we contribute to the climate crisis openly, and we need to be a better part of the solution. And so what they throw up on the platform throughout the year are a series of projects. This is not theory. These are not, abstract challenges. These are real problems that LVMH is engaging with. So again, it makes it very credible, authentic. And then pitch teams come together from across those 75 brands. They come across cultures, disciplines, expertise, experience. So you've often got 4 or 5 generations working with each other who would never have met, let alone have now learnt to work with each other effectively. So again, going back to that point, it's a great example, Trevor, of how they've invested in building collaborative muscle, exercising that in the everyday, and making it real. So the winning work actually is made real, and it's hardwired to sustainable solutions. So I'll pause there, but I thought it's just such a powerful example on so many levels. Yes, this is an organization of 200,000 people, but it has so much applicability and relevance. And to date, 30,000 people are engaged at any point in time on that platform, which is absolutely phenomenal. And it's since gone on to become an open platform for innovation. So a great example of how we're thinking about connecting employee experience to consumer experience.
Great example. Everybody, you can put in questions in the Q&A. There is, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is um, a little box called Q&A. So I'll be looking for that a little later. I mean, you don't have to. I've got enough questions to fill the rest of the day myself, but uh, we're very democratic here at Green Park. Just one thing about that example you gave, Rebecca. I think for most or a lot of people on this call, the task, I mean, they can hear the ideas, but the task for them will be to persuade their colleagues, or more importantly, the
Mhm.
suits upstairs, that this is worth trying and not just a thing for somebody else. When everybody's worried about, quarterly numbers and so on and so forth, how did they persuade LVMH to embrace this? Because presumably it had to be embraced corporately.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that question because this comes up a lot of times, especially as I'm talking, and again, you're talking about again the leadership teams. Well, first of all, it begins with is the leadership team aligned with the narrative that we've just talked about, with the gambit that you opened with, both yourself and Raj, around what are we really solving for here and where is the opportunity, and how we take agency over that. Because if we haven't got a leadership mindset that's aligned with that, we're already on the back foot. So that's, I think, the most important thing, and where education and awareness and aligning on what we're really solving for and why is important. The crucial thing is this is not additive. This is not, and it's interesting. That's why I often it was a session that I was running yesterday. Some of my opening gambit was also, let's be clear on what this is not. It's not putting people in 5x5s. It's not a project. It's not an initiative. It's not a trend. It's not actually, while it is a dimension of diversity, absolutely, but it's the one dimension of diversity that we all share. We are all going to age. So this unifying factor, it's bigger than this, and it's fundamental to the future of our business. As we're thinking about, and we might get onto this later, what will retirement look like? What will the whole concept of a lifetime look like? But the fundamental point here, it's not about doing more. And I think that's where the business case begins with, if everyone with us today, and I want to quote, I love the work that, and I know you're familiar with it, Trevor, and, Megan Wright talks about organizations and pathologically busy organizations. And the reason I say that is I can't tell you how many times I'll have conversations with CEOs and leadership teams. And one of the things I often ask, if I get, that sort of pushback around, oh, but this is just another thing we have to do, is it's absolutely the obverse of that. This is the fil rouge, if you will, the red thread, the horizontal that runs through an organization and is your platform to empower and enable all of this. And so that pathological busyness essentially is reflecting, well, do we have the conditions to do any of this in the first place? So going back to the LVMH and that business case. And if I ask CEOs, I'll often say, well, look, how many projects, initiatives, task forces, ERGs, committees have you got going on in your organization? Answer in 30 seconds. Invariably, there isn't an answer. And if there is, it's about 90% off what the actual number is. Because, of course, what's happened, and COVID has been a part of this, and you mentioned that earlier, as you've pivoted, the Global Talent Conferences is now virtual. We're able to, and the pros and cons of this. And of course, with COVID, we had an accumulation of, good intent. This accumulation of a project overload that is experienced in a number of organizations. And by the way, that came through not just through our research in the book. It was evidence from everyone from Gartner to a whole host of other surveys in the industry. But it's being felt at the most by those rising into their careers, early careers, saying sort of, we've landed in, our first role or sort of, early promotion. And, those first early careers, those formative years in the world of work, what are we expected to prioritize? Or how do we look at our North Star? We can see good intent here. We can see there's a lot of good stuff going on. So that's why I talk a lot about, we need to be careful around, do we have the healthy conditions for us to do, for example, the work that Letitia was just talking about at LVMH? Or is there more fundamental work needed to be done? And again, that work simply is, we need to sometimes denoise the organization, because if you look at those, 150, 200, 300 plus in many cases, easily, projects, initiatives, and task forces, A lot of them are no longer relevant because they have done their job. They're potentially not being sustained. At worst, they're becoming a distraction or indeed a dilution. And again, it's taking resources, time, and attention when all of those things are in absolute precious demand. Again, we're looking to ever more effective and efficient businesses. But I think in the name of efficiency, we can never lose sight of effectiveness, which is what you opened with. So this is very much in the spirit of, again, investing in fewer things, doing them well and sustaining them. And to do that, we need to, and you touched on at the very beginning, we need to ask ourselves some hard questions and get that business case investment to say, we're not asking you to do more. Already people leaders, I'm sure everyone on our talent conference today would say, I'm being asked to do more with less, Rebecca. Absolutely. There is more responsibility on my plate as a people leader and more sense of responsibility as people talked about trust, ethics, and integrity and the whole ramifications of that. But I think this is where this first mover moment, this ninja move for us as people leaders is to take that business case to leadership. Therein is the proof positive, investing in fewer things, doing them well, and sustaining them. Not to say that there isn't agile experimentation in that. LVMH is a classic example of how they have been experimental and innovated, but they're not putting their eggs in 100 baskets. They're saying, actually, let's invest in fewer things well and sustain them.
And it also sounds as though they are doing something, whether formally or informally, which I've always been attracted to, which is to insert a sunset clause on any policy. I,
Yes.
I think both in the public political realm, but also in the corporate realm, there's quite a lot of things that get done and keep getting done because they got done before, irrespective of whether they've actually achieved their outcomes or not. And I've seen quite a lot of examples of people just uh, creating a budget, or not feeding a budget line, I should say, feeding a budget line because it's always been there, rather than saying, "Yep, won that one, got it. Let's go and do something else." Just on the chat, Jenna has asked about an acronym. I'm not quite sure what the acronym you were asking about, Jenna. Maybe um, you might comment again just to so we can see exactly what it is you were after. Um, just before I go to the Q&As, Rebecca, um, what uh, what would you expect the people at this conference to want to do? I mean, what's their part in it? That as we've got a lot of people. We'll have chief people officers online and so on. What's their next step?
Well, it's interesting. I mentioned I was yesterday in Paris with a fantastic group of foresight leaders who manage everything from risk to opportunity and how they're looking at forecasting across the business and risk mitigation strategies to how we're thinking about powering the future of our business. So really, really fascinating, and we're having this similar conversation. And I think the same applies. We've got a couple of hundred people with us already, not least as this talent conference will evolve over the next couple of days. And I think every time we convene a group of people, what will have changed as a result of us coming here here together today? And as you say, we have such an incredible melting pot of talent, diversity of thought and perspective. Let's think about the next 6 months, 18 months, 3 years. You talked about, coming back, we're here a year on. When we come back next year, what will have changed because of some of these conversations we're having and how we act? And again, going back to that point, it's not about doing more. It's about something actually we're going to have to stop some things in our business because actually this will be the reset moment or at least some level of reset to empower the future of our business and that sustained relevance. And as we know, I mean, let's reflect on the Davos, sort of bellwethers as one of many on an annual basis. And you know this more than anyone, Trevor, around what is keeping up, chairs and CEOs around the world every single year. Well, one of those top three is, will my business be relevant in the next decade? And this is a big answer to that question. I think the more that we engage around the language of business and the things that are, the fear factors that are in that boardroom, and we come into that boardroom with this kind of conversation, that I think is the real impetus of change. So that's the first point. The second point, of course, is do we have the conditions for change going around, going back to the point around do we need to denoise the organization? I think I want to share, I love that mutuality came up, the whole notion of Ubuntu and this notion of mutuality and intentionality, because they were, if I go through the research and what was common to the organizations who were already doing just this, Trevor, they're acting on it. They have invested 3, 4, 5 years ago, or, they are on this pathway right now. They're seeing in this as a maximizing opportunity. How are we part of the solution? How are we investing also in more interdisciplinary thinking and ways of working? Because we also know that, and you touched on this, as we're having to work ever more at the intersection of things where problems are more complex and urgent and interconnected, I think it's challenging. Things can feel very other, they can feel very abstract. What agency do we have as an HR director in XYZ company? What can I do? And I think, that is in my humble way. I want to make sure that I'm doing everything in my power and capability to empower those conversations, to say, look, this is how change happens. So mutuality, intentionality are two common factors. Mutuality, as we know, it's one of the principles of Mars. We are very fortunate to have a chance to talk with the family businesses that I mentioned were fascinating, really crucibles of understanding how are they working, how are they thinking, and mutuality, as we know, is one of the founding principles of Mars all those decades ago. Yes, we know that family businesses are not constrained in the same way that many of the organizations on with us today, and I'm sure there are some family businesses, but how we reconcile short term with long term, which is why it was so thrilling to see long term thinking coming up in the chat earlier on as we talked about organizational values, because this is where, and to quote some of the other values that came up in the chat, bold, courageous. We have to really put our bets on bold, courageous things that make sense, that will sustain relevance over time. So that's why I can't stress enough how mutuality and deep intentionality have put in part of this. So going back to those organizational values, how are we connecting our organizational values, whether they be 3, 4, 5, whatever they are, with this sense of shared value in our work? And that goes back, and I love your point about sunsetting, Trevor. It's a beautiful phrase. The sunset clause, that should be on a future pod somewhere as, the tips. But you're right, because again, sometimes it's often good intent, but how do we think about ownership? Ownership even of those projects that have had their day, served their purpose, but they're still getting fed with sort of budget, time, and resource, are effectively then taking away from the shared greater good and that whole sort of greater sense of mutuality and mutual value. So I guess the final thing is also to address the say-do gap, because I think where I hear from so many people, leaders that I work with, again, they've got so much more responsibility in their remit, often less budget along the way with the constraints that we've been talking about. But I think it's incumbent upon leadership as well. Again, if the alignment around the conversation and just this conversation we're having alone today and the time that we've had to say, I get it. And we need to close the say-do gap, because younger generations, especially, and you mentioned your niece, will call out that difference between what we say in our organizational values, but actually how is that showing up in different ways? And if there is a gap in how leadership is acting or role modeling or in other manifestations. I mean, it's a beautiful example from, Mishcon de Reya, one of the law firms. And as we know, law firms are being disrupted exponentially when we think about AI, automation, how we think about skills pipelines and talent pipelines. But for many years, they have invested very overtly. They don't actually say it, but they do it. Their events are cross-generational. So it's not the partners at every event talking about the case studies. It's through the gamut of the people who have worked. And again, that's one very simple example, in the same way that your sunset principle is. Every organization can do that. How and where do we show up? Is it always the most senior people in our organization talking at the events? Or rather, we have 5 generations at work. Wouldn't we love to hear from everyone who's working on that project? And the similar principle goes to, Pixar, as we know over the years, has excelled. One of the reasons they've excelled, Ed Catmull has believed in the value of the brain trust and the collective power of the brain trust. But again, going perhaps the final point here, Trevor, is do we have the conditions for healthy divergent opinion? Because in a world, and you touched on this at the very beginning, that is defaulting to binaries, to really sort of hard lines and to polarization, this is where I think, and when we see it in the research, younger generations especially are looking potentially to brands as the new North Stars now. So the corporations are, where are we, the beacons of trust, and the new North Stars actually to set that integrity, respect, and the trust, and all those beautiful values that have come through on that chat earlier on. That's the North Star that we are all responsible for. And it's our leadership, again, who needs to be aligned with us around, how we're going to get there in the next 3, 5, 10 years.
It's interesting. And one of the other words alongside collaboration that's popped up in the chat is communication. And communication is a complex thing because it doesn't just mean, as I think people tend to think these days, tell them.
Mm,
So has to mean listening and hearing. And I think in far too many corporate contexts, communication consists of transmit rather than receive. Or rather, the transmit button is on all the time, and the senior leaders never quite turn on the receive button. But then there's a separate, a consequent issue, which is, and this is something I myself had to learn rather painfully, which is that what you say isn't necessarily what is heard. And
mm,
just to give you a very concrete example, in an organization that I ran, I used to have a Friday morning open session in which um, anybody could come, irrespective of rank, and everybody could put their tuppence in and so on and so forth. Um, and I thought for quite a long time, this is cool, this is the right thing to do, and so on and so forth. It took me quite a long time, months, to grasp that nobody else thought of those Friday morning sessions in the way that I did, which was open-minded and so on. They thought it was the opportunity to hear from the boss what they needed to do. So
mm.
I might say, "What do you think about this?" And everybody heard that as he wants us to do this. Now, how do you manage this issue of the two-way communication that you're implying is going to be necessary across these lines of generational difference?
Well, I love that you brought up communication because in the research consistently, and again, that research was across 4 continents, alongside understanding, the ability to better understand our organizations, our demographics, and to understand each other and to value and respect each other was our ability to communicate. So I'm so thrilled that we've got the time to cover that. And I mean, let's begin with I'll actually begin with it was interesting, the good ancestor principle. It's a good time to bring this up. So the closing chapter of the book is future generations, which the publisher said at the time, well, that you don't need that. And I said, yes, but we want this. But this is important. And it's been important for a reason, because I think, organizations traditionally, and again, we see a lot of that changing now, and especially in the more hierarchical structures, the ability to put ourselves in the shoes of somebody else, the ability to walk in somebody else's shoes. And this is the whole sort of good ancestor principle and good ancestor thinking. And the reason I share that is it came up loud and clear through the family businesses that we spoke with. If you listen to Andre Hoffman one of the family members at Roche, if you listen to 3 of the Mars family members, if you listen to Andy Rubin and the Pentland Group, and many other family businesses that we spoke with. But this notion of, thinking ahead, what are the implications for generations who haven't even been born yet? And that's what the good ancestor principle talks about. It gets us into, that deep intentionality, the notion of longer term thinking. So the reason I mention that is, this really starts with, dialogue is, as you said, and I love that example of the Friday, there's expectations and experience all sort of locked up in that. But it starts with, the ability to put ourselves in each other's shoes, which we don't do enough. And that's why I also talk about we need to be so careful. I mean, Alex Mann, as you know, most recently at Channel 4, she did a lot of work on Gen Z, and I quote her in the book because she talked about we're living through an age of overclassification, which in some respects actually is causing us more problem. It's not helping us. So I think, we also need to think about, fewer labels, more lenses. Again, very intentional about how language can help us here. But we think about, if we were to put ourselves in the shoes of another generation. Let's just think about that for a moment. And maybe that's something we can all do coming off this call today. You know, what respective of, I think we've got at least 4 generations from what you and Raj were saying on with us today, probably maybe into even 5 over the next couple of days. But if we were to put ourselves in the shoes of another generation, what does the world of work look and feel like? You know, if we were starting work today as a 21, 22-year-old, you know, how does that look and feel? Let's think about younger generations rising into the workplace. What have they grown? You know, their modus op, and you touched on this with your niece, their modus op is they've grown up and been exposed to, you know, brands that have been, by the way, targeting, as we use the word, targeting them, looking to reach them with communications that are highly personalized, highly interactive, more participatory. So to your point, you know, from organizational communications, which has been much more about inform, transmit, that way of communicating has been much more participatory, much more personalized, involved, even co-creative with some brands, you know, because that's been the whole success of, you know, some you know, deeply consumer-led brands who are seeking to engage their generations coming through. So, I mean, these are not rocket science principles, but I think we need to think more in the context of, again, you know, putting ourselves in each other's shoes. How does that translate? It's not, the answer doesn't need to be, which I often hear, it's sort of, you know, a plurality and proliferation of communication preferences. It's simply, what's the North Star of our business? How is our organization wired? How do we better need to understand, communicate with, and listen with each other? And I think the final punchline to Trevor is also in unlearning, because unlearning comes both ways. And you touched on it there. I love that. So one of the things I've been a champion of over the best part of the decade, actually 8 to 10 years, is the next generation board or next. I mean, we know in social enterprise, you know, it's actually how I discovered the concept of youth advisory boards. You know, Lewis Hamilton and Jason Arthur at Mission 44, for example, have had a youth advisory board ab initio. And this is an organization that's dedicated to empowering pathways in high performing sports. So education, social mobility, the same for the EY Foundation. So we know this to be true in highly effective social enterprises. Where it hasn't been so true is in the corporate world. And of course, what do we know? This is why, again, diversity around who are we listening to and why, you know, what is the conversation that is really going on? Because again, you know, Green Park, you have all the latest data, but, you know, I think you and Raj can quote better than I can, but, you know, it's around 60 something. And when we look at the average age of board members across the world, well, what if we started that talent pipeline earlier? And the idea with the next generation board, which doesn't necessarily need to be a sort of Gen Z board, but the idea is, you know, if we are an organization serving 5 generations of consumers potentially, why do we only have 1 generation in the boardroom? And actually, part of that, we don't start our talent pipeline early enough. So I share that as, again, another solution potentially, another platform that we can think about to help with some of this unlearning, because that unlearning, just to close out that point, comes in both ways. I've seen it in, you know, that sense of imposter syndrome from, you know, 20 somethings being selected for a next generation board, saying, I can't believe I have this opportunity, you know, and the work that you need to do to say, this is your moment, this is your time, we're going to invest in you. And at the same time, leadership saying, what a great idea, a next generation board, but feeling then rather uncomfortable when that next generation board is in the boardroom with them. So I think you touch on a really important point here that I know we're getting close to time, but I think unlearning, also again, doing fewer things well and sustaining them, and some common principles along the way, mutuality, intentionality, understanding where we need to unlearn a little bit as well. I think, again, common factors of success.
Good. We've got 10 minutes or so. We've got a bit of time. Just a couple of quick responses. Steph, on the say do gap, I think. Thank you for that comment. I think when I'm not sure who's speaking to us from CMI, but I know this is very much a CMI thing, and it's worth holding that one to raise it. Rebecca, somebody's asked which 4 continents?
So we worked across Europe, the Americas, South America, Africa, and Asia.
Great. Okay.
We didn't quite get to all 7. Next time.
Um, Going back to, there's an earlier set of questions in the Q&A, which let me try and summarize it this way. I always say in politics that the most loathsome 4 words are "I told you so." Nobody ever needs to hear that. But in the corporate world, I would say the equivalent is "I'd love to, but." And somebody is really asking how, there are a couple of people basically who've asked, how do you kick sluggish organizations into thinking about this, or and somebody specifically referred to local authorities? Essentially, how do you deal with inertia?
How do you deal with inertia? Well, first of all, I think there is something in the collective here as well. I go back to, again, it can feel very lonely, I think, sometimes. And, and this is regardless of scale of organization. If you are that voice and you see all the things that we're talking about. So again, I go back to the fact that, look at the convening power of who we have today. Not suggesting that we all know each other and the 200 people on this forum, but I think there is something in how can we find our collective? How can we better share and be more agile and effective, with sharing this knowledge between us? One of the reasons in writing the book, and to your point, and thank you for teeing that up at the beginning, is that, this is about being part of the solution. This is why I was very careful in evidencing the work that is ultimately celebrated. And there's a whole body of work behind it, saying, look, please be open. In order for us to include these case studies, we would like you to share not just the top line, but unpack the why. What were the lessons along the way? And I think one of those common principles was this sense of this collective brain trust of our own, if you will. So how do we gather more sort of collective muscle and solidarity to do that? And again, there's a lot of work. I mean, look at Linda Grattan. She's done a lot of work on, the whole concept of the 100-year life and longevity. And so, I feel that I'm, one part of, a bigger voice of advocacy around what we need to do. But I think being united in doing that, I think, is one. Second of all, I think is, again, the sharing the same language, that there is so much now that is defaulting. I loved how you teed up. There is huge opportunity in the time that I hope, by the way, to go back to your point about hope. I like to think that we're living through a new renaissance, because in the same way that it's been talked about the age of AI, but when we think about the Renaissance didn't become the age of the printing press. It was the Renaissance at a time when art and science, humanity and technology, again, it was a huge time in history. But the reason I say that as well, I like to think long-term thinking. How will this age that we are living through right now be talked about in generations to come, in centuries to come? 250 years from now, maybe it'll be sooner. What will this age, if it will be defined, how will it be? And I think, again, that's also part of that isn't written in the stars. It's not all incumbent in, the tech powers that be. And that's why, the words of Einstein very much traveled with me in writing the book. He, very, ostensibly one of the most prescient. You go back to the priests and the seers, Trevor. But, that quote of, he said, there will come a time when an exponential leap in technology will command and demand an exponential leap in human relations. And this is what we're all in the business of, human relations. And I suppose, again, we just one parting thought to sort of round out on that point is, you triggered something that's been on my mind for a while now, and actually Azim Hazar, who brilliant book on exponential. Some of you may follow him. One of the sort of seers, if you will, in AI. But the whole notion of value inversion, I think, is, and I think that can also help us in our business case, in our conversations, because we think about how the inversion of value is manifesting a number of ways. And as I say, Azim wrote a very incisive piece on this, but, talking to how our fundamental economic grammar is shifting, the language of supply, as we think about, demand, the equilibrium of that we've trusted really since Adam Smith is out of date. And as we think about, and you touched on this earlier, the value of a university degree, the premium that it used to command, that it used to readily command, and the harsh realities now for those rising into the workplace. Second point around, if we think about how incomes have grown more quickly for some pensioners than working age counterparts. So I think, again, this whole concept of value inversion is absolutely our business, and whether we're feeling it already. But I think it really puts us into, how has this sort of fundamental economic grammar shifted, and how can we really elevate that conversation that we are having with our own leadership teams? And then coming back to that point of, if we're hardwiring it to collective intelligence, we're not just the lone wolf, in that room, and we are not batting for our project. And that's the other thing. I think this is not us taking ownership of our thing or our project. This is the future of the business. This is the sustained relevance of the business that keeps the CEO up at night at Davos, year in, year out. And if we couch it in those terms, I think we have a better chance of really, raising the problems, but crucially the opportunities. And go back to your point around hope and ambition. We have to be part of the solution, and we are so well placed as people leaders to be part of that solution if we are enabled. So I think it's our, how do we rise to that challenge ever more? And again, our call to action to leaders and to chairs the world over to also meet us. Come to your point, how do we meet in the middle here? What is that point of mutuality? Where is everyone's open Friday, Trevor? Perhaps that's our call to action for the day. How is that our metaphor and emblem for what we're talking about?
I always like it when we're doing a session and I learn a new phrase which encapsulates something I've been struggling to articulate. And value inversion is new to me, but it expresses it exactly. Um, uh, I'm going to come to a sort of last question in a moment, but before we get there, Yvonne's has asked an interesting question about picking up on your reference to unlearning. And she's asking what types of behaviors within boardrooms need to be unlearned in order to do what you've talked about, which is bringing younger and more diverse voices around the table.
Well, thank you, Yvonne, for that, and thank you so much for picking up on learning because it's not often talked about, but I think it's again something that if we lean into it and if we do it well, it can unlock so much in the organisation, and also one of those things that I think can often get overlooked as being, well, this is just the way that we do things around here. It gets accepted. So thank you so much for championing that. I'll probably go back to those deep principles that were common to all the organisations featured as case studies in the book, but also through the research, which is intentionality, mutuality, respect, collaboration, trust, those five big things underpinned all of this. So that has to go back to, I think, first of all, our culture is our greatest superpower. So again, with our leadership team and our boards, as we know, culture is at the crux of all of this. And so if how we are showing up in that context is somewhat antithetical, to those values, then again, going back to that, it's the same principle with the say-do gap, exactly. So that's where I think the conversation begins, and where I go back to that notion of how we build and exercise muscle. Because if we hold hard to collaboration is deeply rooted in our organizational values, and it's been there for a decade, but we are having to have hard conversations around principles of unlearning, whether that's from, as I say, imposter syndrome on one hand, but in the context of the boardroom, what we say we would like. I mean, at its worst, it's the whole sort of commitment to, yes, these are great ideas, but it becomes tokenistic. And again, we see through that in a heartbeat, and younger generations rising into work see that even faster, which is why, again, the role modeling of leadership is absolutely vital. But I would come back, Yvonne, again to those five principles. Our organizational values, our culture are always our superpowers, and so let's go back to those, and let's not quite hold feet to the fire, but that really is it's the crux of, as we've always said over the years, great brands begin and are sustained with great people, and that's on our watch. That's on our. But again, we are to an extent, constrained by, where ever more responsibility is on our plates, where the budget constraints, et cetera, et cetera. But those five principles are absolutely integral, Yvonne, to unlocking that unlearning, if you will. So thanks for a great question.
I should have said, but you can tell that though there's a place for the senior citizen in every workplace, some of us that do suffer from memory loss. And I should have said that Tamara Box is going to be with us speaking for CMI. And actually, Tamara and I worked very closely together when I chaired the Everyone Economy group at CMI, and she, of course, still chairs the women's project at CMI. I think it'll definitely worth hearing where they've got to. If we can, I guess, come to an end here, Rebecca. We're still, in a way, in spite of the fact that people, I think, say that there's been a backlash and everybody's backing off DEI and so on and so forth. In the real world, um, everybody who has to deal with human resource, human capital, people, does understand that human difference
Mm,
matters. And that, as with all tools, right from fire through nuclear weapons, now to drones and so on, you can always use the technology, you can always use what you understand about human nature for good or for ill. And I think we still haven't quite got down to the place where we understand how we can manage difference in a way that is to the advantage of organizations. And I want to make a distinction here between social justice, which,
Mm.
no secret where I stand on that, and organizational good. And quite often, the two things, I'd like to think that in most free societies, the two things are parallel, but they're not the same thing. And for most people on this call, their living is made by making their organizations better. And the question they have to ask themselves is whatever we think about, as it were, the socially just solutions and so on, how do we make managing and understanding and using difference in a way that benefits our organizations? So we don't have to answer the question, should I pay attention to the human dimensions of my work, or should I pay attention to my results? But they actually become the same thing.
I love that. Okay, so gosh, in the time we've got, can I begin with Toni Morrison though? Because I love that you started with human difference, Trevor, which has taken me to, again, going back to my sort of quote nerdy moments, but so Toni Morrison's Nobel Prize acceptance speech is just stunning. One of the reasons, and again, sorry, this is how my brain works in a very weird way, but you said human difference. And a short fragment from that Nobel Prize acceptance speech is she talks about meaning that secures our difference, our human difference. So I just wanted to pause on that because it's so that whole notion of meaning that secures our difference, our human difference, I think is so deeply relevant and resonant to everything that you just laid out in that closing gambit. So and again, it's just a phenomenal speech if you seek it out. It's just wonderful. But I love that we've closed out on this because that was the whole theory behind going into that research to say that with this expanded diversity and difference, rather than getting caught up in this stereotyped and siloed generational divisions and this divisive discourse that rages on headlines and in social media, we are better as humanity, let alone in our roles that you've just talked about. We are here in 2025 and there should be a bigger solution. So it's all about how can we manage difference that is to the advantage, and it's cultural, collaborative, and competitive advantage. I think a couple of things that I just talk about, I think one of which is acknowledging, I mean, it's ways of working that get us there. That's why I go back to that point and I ask that point around what would you put a bet on as, in terms of those cited organizational values. Well, that's absolutely fine that collaboration comes up, but it means absolutely nothing if it just sits there, as a word on the wall. It's silent in our annual report. And in the Oxford work, they also talk, Trevor, about the difficulty of collaboration, as in the difficulty of effective collaboration. And that's again on what you're getting at in terms of what changes as a result of our ability to understand each other better, to value each other better, and to respect and understand that difference is one thing. The ability to do something with it and to affect change as a result is another. And again, that's why I go back to these connected things of, Megan Wright's principle about the, pathologically busy organization. Again, we can't keep doing more with less. And part of that is just less time. Do we have effective and good conditions for all of this to actually come into being, let alone for it to thrive and to flourish, which is where the high performing organizations already are. And those of us, again, who are on that pathway will be. So I'd close out with that. And I think the other thing I would quote, if that's just two quotes, if I will, because it's deeply relevant. Lena Nair at Chanel is a great exemplar of when we talk about collaborative models of leadership. Connected to collective intelligence, and what she is doing now, she talks a lot about the era of the superhero models of leadership are over, and we need to actively invest in connecting individual difference to collective intelligence. That's a direct quote from Lena in the book as well. And then the final one, I'm going to close out, if I may, with Anne Carson. So I do get inspired by, I love writers and poetry and literature. And she said, to stay human is to break a limitation. I love Anne. Anne Carson is a genre-defying author who, transcends different categories and cultures and genres. And one of the reasons why I quote her, but I think really that's our challenge and our call to action, both as individuals and to collectives. To stay human is to break a limitation in a very good, constructive, empowering, and to use your phrase, to close full circle, in a very hopeful way, Trevor.
Rebecca, thank you so much. of course, we could carry on all morning, but everybody, um, you don't have to be mediated by me to get at Rebecca's work. You can buy Five Generations at Work, How We Win Together for Good. But I would suggest you get on with it because I'm looking at Amazon and there are only 14 left in stock.
Oh.
It's flying off the shelves. You can, of course, go to Kindle, but that's it's more beneficial to Rebecca if you buy the actual book. Rebecca, that was fantastic. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Okay, we're going to take a 5 minute break, everybody. We're back at 10:40, but get here on time because we'll be joined for a session on financial services. Does culture still eat strategy for breakfast with the British and Ireland Irish Lion and World Cup winner, and also even more importantly, an advisor at Green Park, Will Greenwood.